Good morning, sunshines. Hope the quarantine is going well. Again, you should be working on your finished model. They're due this coming Thursday the 16th, maybe Thursday week. Anyway, you've got a little time on them, but what you need to have done, several of you still haven't given me your elevation, your color elevation. You should have printed it off. I sent you your elevation that you gave me. Everybody turned in an elevation, so you've all done that part. More than half of you, but about 5 of you still haven't sent me the color version of that. Color that in, and then draw and color the other walls, 2 or 3 or 4, or how many other walls you got in the set. Again, the one you did should have been the largest wall, so everything should be smaller from now on. Color everything in, cut it all out, tape it all together, put it on a nice floor. I will send you a couch and a chair and a person that's in 1/2 inch scale for you to also include in your model. But that's where you need to be working on. Yes, in addition to listening for the notes. Cool. Today we're going to talk about the history of design. We're going to go all the way back to the beginning of the theater with the Greeks. The Greeks certainly invented theater as we know it today. Tragedies, comedies. The Greeks performed outdoors, and so they didn't have a whole lot to do with lighting. You got the sun or you don't have the sun. But they did come up with several scenic innovations. Among them are these things called periactoi. Periactoi are like prisms, large standing prisms, and they would have 3 sides, and you would paint a different set on each side of the prism and then rotate the prism. And so not only are they inventing prisms, they're also inventing scenic paintings to trick the eye. Now, the fun thing about these things is knowing what I know about prisms and knowing that I know they were outdoors, these things would have been big old sails. And so where exactly they put these things on stage is a good question. Unfortunately, the Greeks built everything out of wood. Of course, wood doesn't last 2,500 years. And so it's our best guess as to where those things may have been put on the stage. They may have been put underneath, in front of the scheme, the raised area. They may have been put on top of the raised platform. Who knows? You can see there's a little diagram there. They also invented little winches. They had these wagons called ekiklima, which would roll out from the center doors to expose tableaus, that sort of thing. So they had stairs, and they would climb up, and the level of the gods is the top level. There are many Greek plays where the gods actually interact with the actors on stage, and that's where the gods would be. Again, the chorus would dance in the orchestra, the lower level there, and then the actors would be on the stage. A lot of what we think we know about the Greek stage, we actually know because the Romans copied the Greek stage, and the Romans, instead of building it out of wood, built it out of stone. And of course, those things are still there. So here's an example of a Roman stage. You can see that there are 3 doors in the Roman stage, so it's presumed, since they're copying the Greeks, that the Greek stage may have had 3 doors as well. My guess is it may have eventually evolved into 3 doors, but it didn't necessarily mean that it had 3 doors to begin with. Now, it also is true that there were never more than 3 actors on stage in Greek theater at any one time. There were more than 3 characters in the shows, but they would just change masks, and there were never more than 3 actors on stage. And with 3 actors and 3 doors, it sounds to me like each one of those doors might have been some sort of dressing room for the actors to take advantage of that sort of thing. Much of what we know architecturally about how these theaters were built comes from a book called De Architectura, which was written by a man named Vitruvius around 25 BC. There are a lot of things, we lose a lot of this information for several reasons, but when the Renaissance begins, this cache of knowledge comes from the library that had been at Constantinople and makes its way back to Italy. And so there are these Italian architects, we'll talk about Serlio in just a second, who start rediscovering the way the Greeks and the Romans built things. For instance, one of the things that had been lost was this idea of a keystone bearing the weight of an arch. And because an arch, if you put it together, can also make a dome, the technology to create those things was lost over time. And so when Serlio started reading De Architectura, Vitruvius, basically it was 10 different books, and in one he would describe what the building looked like, another who described what the use of the building was, one who describes how they built it, the important aspects like the keystone, etc. And so as he's starting to translate these from Latin, again, Latin was a lost language by the time of Serlio, a couple hundred in the 14th century AD. And so Serlio, Sebastiano Serlio, we'll talk a little bit about Serlio. He was an architect of the Medici family. He lived from 1475 to 1554. And among the things that he discovered by analyzing De Architectura was this thing called the 5 orders of ancient architecture. 4 of them are Greek and Roman. 1 of them is Roman only. And so he didn't describe this one, but Serlio translated and made it his style. First of all, the 3 that are specifically Greek, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. Now, if you think of Doric, if you've ever seen the cemetery at Arlington National Cemetery, those are very Doric columns. Doric columns are very large, they're substantial. If you've ever seen the Parthenon, those are Doric columns. They have a round top, they flare, the columns flare mightily, and there is no base to the columns. Ionic columns have scroll tops at the top, and then they do have a base. Corinthian columns have very ornate capitals with a lot of, oftentimes there'll be a description of wars and different reliefs in the capitals in Corinthian columns. The one column that is specifically Italian is the Tuscan column. The Tuscan column, if you imagine taking a little marshmallow and squeezing it, that's sort of what a Tuscan, it's a little bit more rounded than the Doric, and the Tuscan column also has a base. The composite category is where you would translate or transfer the capital from the Corinthian, for instance, and put it on a Doric base, or have a Tuscan top on an Ionic base. So a composite is really just mix and matching the other 4 styles if you're creating some sort of capital. There are 3 parts to a building. There's the roof. The edge of the roof is what the Romans called the entablature. Again, this is where they would put a lot of friezes, where they would have who the building was dedicated to, the gods that it was dedicated to, or the war was dedicated about. There's the columns. And again, the column is made up of 3 parts. There's the capital, there's the shaft, and there's the base. And again, typically each column will, in each order will have a specific one of those. And if you mix and match them in any way, you have a composite capital or a composite column. And then the pedestal is the floor. Instead of leveling the earth, because they didn't have earth movers, they would just build up the ground and then create a level surface floor. But the front might be 5 foot tall and have stairs going up, and the back might be level with the earth. So in other words, instead of leveling the earth, they level the platform to build the building on, and that's the pedestal. Again, the pedestal still has 3 parts. You have the capital, the shaft, and the base, but the shaft is also where they would typically have painted pictures, not so much in relief, because you could actually walk up and touch the floor, the pedestal. A lot of times it was more, stucco. It was also mosaics, that sort of stuff. Whereas because the tablature was so far away from you, it was often carved, and because of that, it's lasted longer in time. Cool. But those are among the things that Serlio discovered once he started reading through De Architectura. The 5 orders, if you remember those would be really good. One of the fun things about the Alabama State Capitol, it has been redesigned over the years, and there are actually 3 different types of columns on the Capitol building. Over time, they've redesigned the south portico, for instance, was at least the latest one to be redesigned about 10 years ago. And they took out the old capitals, which were Ionic, and they put in new capitals, which are Doric. It is in itself, walking around the building, a lesson in the styles of architecture, which is a wonderful thing to happen. Before we get into the Renaissance, there is the Elizabethan theater. The Elizabethan theater grew out of Mummers plays, which was the first professional theater, and they took place in inns, basically. And so when James Burbage built the first theater, called The Theater, in 1576, he just copied what the inn yard of a local inn, restaurant, the establishment might be, and that's where he put the stage. And so the effect in scene design is that suddenly you just had, it was very much like what became known as Impressionism, where you would just bring out a bench and that would be a park, or you would just bring out a flag and that would be the war scene, the battlefield. And so it became very representative instead of putting full realism on stage or using any kind of scenic painting to describe the scene. Elizabethan theater, beckoned to a new history that was going to come a couple, like 300-400 years later. But quickly it was overtaken by the Renaissance. Welcome to the Renaissance. One of the other things that Serlio did is because he was the architect for the Medicis, because they were very interested in this new style thing called theater, he started producing theater. He built buildings that were theatrical, and of course, because he's an architect, he moved the theater indoors as opposed to having it outdoors. And nothing in the text said anything about the theaters being outdoors. Because he's an architect, he built buildings. So he put it inside theater, and from then on, theater's inside for the most part. He also knew that there were three types of theater. He could tell there was comedy, he could tell there was tragedy, and what we call today melodrama, he called pastoral plays. And so he designed a set for each of them. Now, he also invented, again, accidentally, somewhat on purpose, in order to foreshorten the stage so he didn't have to take up as much room as it needed, or as it looked like it had. And because lighting was very dim, because you're using candlelight or gaslight at the best, he would angle the stage or rake the stage, and it would force the eye to look like it's in perspective. So he invented the single point perspective. He invented also a set for tragedy, which takes place in a city. He invented a set for a comedy, which he said takes place in a country town. And he invented a set for pastoral plays, which he said took place outside in the wild. And so he was the first person to put that type of theater painting on stage that we have evidence of. It could have happened earlier. Other people may have been painting on stage, but by Serlio's time, it certainly was happening. And so I'm going to say he invented scenic painting. Now, there's a family of painters. It's called the Bibienas, and they perfected scenic painting. Whereas Serlio had used single point perspective, the Bibienas are most noted for using multi-point perspective. And again, if you can look at that first little drawing there with the column, with the archway, you can see that there's the perspective goes through the archway, but then you can also see the front of the building, which has a different perspective. It's a little easier to see with the garrison. You can see the two sides of the building, and the stage right side of the building has one perspective line, and the stage left side of the building has a second perspective line. And it just makes the drawings, the paintings, far more interesting because it looks like they're rounded, more dimensional. And you can see there's a list here of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 Bibienas who over the course of 150 years perfected the art of scenic painting and tricking the eye. Yes? Now, there was another scenic designer during this time period. Again, you're talking about 16th century now, in Italy. His name is Giacomo Torelli. And by the time of Torelli, I don't think he personally invented the chariot and pole system, but he is the one to popularize it for sure. Before I describe it to you, I think it's just easier if you watch this little video about the workings of a chariot and pole system. There's a couple of theaters around today that still have working chariot and pole systems. And here's a little example of what they look like on stage, but also underneath. So you can see that there's a system of ropes that start underneath the stage, and you turn some pulleys, and you have both at the same time some flats moving on stage and some flats moving off stage. So you may have a pastoral scene with trees and plants and things moving on stage at the same time you have a country scene leaving the stage. Again, this is after Serlio's death, but you still have that single point perspective, and you can see in the video that the backdrops would fly in and out, and it was magic to the eyes of the people who were living in that time period. Torelli was hired by Cardinal Richelieu, who was the leading artist or leading theater person in France during the time of Louis XII, XIII, and XIV. Richelieu brought Torelli in, and so Torelli brought this system of chariot and poles with him to France during the Renaissance. So by now you're talking about the 17th century when it became popularized in France, and there's an English architect named Inigo Jones who sees these innovations in France and is the first to bring the scenic painting innovations as opposed to using Elizabethan stage. Now we move indoors, and suddenly we have backdrops with colorful painting and chariot and pole systems. And Inigo Jones is the person who brought all that information to England. Now, for about 300 years, from around 1500 to around 1800, this is the style of art that is most predominant in theater. Again, you have very dim lit stage. The actors would stand on front of the stage and proclaim, and then you'd have these beautiful backdrops and or scenic elements. They would also use periactoi, as opposed to having the chariot and poles. Different theaters that didn't have the grooves and the chariots and poles that would work, they would use periactois that would spin, so harken back to the days of the Greeks. But it wasn't really until Gordon Craig came along in the middle of the century that suddenly we ridded ourselves of all this scenic painting and trying to trick and fool the eye. And Gordon Craig was he was a set designer. His mother was Ellen Terry, but apparently he had a very high squeaky voice, so even though he wanted to be involved in the theater, he was never going to be an actor. And so he started becoming a set designer. And because at this time you're also developing realism, where suddenly the playwright is ceding responsibility for interpretation of the play, he said that the theater designer, should be an independent artist. They should work separately from anybody else on the stage. You went to see a play, not to hear it, and that the key thing about plays should be artistic unity. And since the set designer was responsible for what the play looked like, he proposed that the set designer should also be in charge of where and how the actors moved. As a matter of fact, he said that theater worked best if the actors were merely puppets. If they would just do what he said and stand where he said, it would make the picture perfect, and that, after all, is what we're after. Again, you can see there's a little example of one of his more famous sets. You can see there's a complete lack of architectural detail. There's no hint at time period. Again, electric lighting is coming into fore, and so Craig and his friend Adolphe Appia are two of the first people to start using lighting to control where you looked on stage. Basically, these were huge unit sets. Again, he designed sets for Richard Wagner, so he designed huge operatic stages. He and Adolphe Appia had a falling out. Adolphe Appia, we'll talk about here in a second, was his buddy for the most of their lives, but they had a falling out because Appia started writing books in which he described and supported Craig's views, but he didn't give Craig any credit. And so Craig is the person who's a practitioner going out there doing the design, having the theories, and Appia is making all the money because he's selling all the books, telling people about this new style of design that strips architecture elements from the piece. I would call this impressionistic theater today if we were looking at it. But again, he talked about how light becomes a very important aspect. Craig leaves Switzerland, which is where he had a theater with Wagner, and he goes to Moscow and he starts working with Konstantin Stanislavski. And so Craig also becomes the leading forefront of realistic design, putting on stage realism. So he is a leader in both movements. Getting back to Appia, Appia was 1862 to 1928. He was a college professor, but again, also a practitioner. He said there were three elements to the stage. There was the actor, there was the perpendicular scenery, and there was the floor. And since the set designer was in charge of two of those things, the set designer should be charged with the third one as well. So again, you can see that he and Craig had very similar ideas. Appia said the major unifying element was light, because again, you've got electric light where you can change color, you can change texture, you can do a lot of things with light that to these people were magic, to us is just common every day. But for the first time, you're able to move about the stage as actors, you're not stuck to the front edge of the stage. And so the age of the scenic artist, while still around, there's still scenic artists painting beautiful backdrops, don't get me wrong, but suddenly the trend is becoming to go away from that style and to do much more impressionistic designs, to have much more casual designs in the sense that they are all just blank sets that can be augmented by pieces that also use light to help define. Cool. The first American set designer to have any international appeal is a man named Robert Edmund Jones. Robert Edmund Jones was born in France, but he lived most of his life in America, in New York. He wrote a book called The Dramatic Imagination, in which he espoused this new type of theater design that spoke to what he called the eye of the mind. In other words, it's expressionistic theater. Expressionism is where you take a set and show the inner thoughts of the characters on the stage as to what the world around them is like. Expressionism, for those of you who saw Wojciech was an expressionistic play, or were involved in Wojciech. Again, angles aren't precise, they're changed. The molding is, if you ever have a set for Dracula's drippy walls and all that sort of stuff, that's expressionism, because it gives you the fear that a normal person. Gothic design is way into expressionism, yes. But he said that the two keys to this new stagecraft, is what he called it, were simplification and suggestion. In other words, instead of giving the audience all the information, spoon-feeding them realism, which is what Craig is doing with Stanislavski in Russia, the set designer should give clues, and for instance, tell an audience where a window or a door might be, but then instead of filling in the walls with all the detail, let the audience fill in the detail for themselves, and that way the audience is involved in the interpretation of the play, if that makes any sense. In other words, let's say you have a play that happens in an old Southern mansion. Well, I don't know if you've been to an old Southern mansion. If you have, my grandparents sort of grew up in one. Let's say you're doing Count Houghton roof. If you just give them the cornice at the top of the wall and maybe a baseboard at the bottom of the wall, and let the audience fill in the gap between, then I can put the wallpaper that was in my grandmother's house on that wall. Craig doesn't, or Robert Edmund Jones doesn't know what that wallpaper was like, but I do. And I have very strong memories about that, what that look and that feel of that room was. And so by doing that, by allowing me as an audience member to have those connections, I then become, as an audience member, more involved in what the interpretation of the play is. Again, that's the key to what he calls the eye of the mind that the set designer should speak toward. Again, it's stepping away from scenic artistry, from tricking the eye, which has been around from the 14th century, and more suggestion, more simplified solutions. And again, as we go into thrust stages and as we go into arena staging, less and less set is going to be required for the audience to understand what's going on in the play. And so the importance of all those selections is being diminished, although having the right choices becomes more and more important. If all you have on stage to represent a kitchen is a refrigerator, it's very important that the refrigerator be the right time period, the right look, the right feel, because that way you're drawing the right connections. If you suddenly put a 2010 refrigerator on a play that happened in 1940, you're going to cause a juxtaposition, which is going to cause more questions than answers, if that makes any sense. Cool. Joe Meltziner, probably the most famous set designer of the golden age of theater in the mid-50s. Again, once the Second World War is over, American theater flourishes. Television is in its infancy. Films are certainly becoming better, but but by no means are the powerful art form that they are today. I'm not saying there weren't any good films in the 50s, but they're few and far between. But theater is having its heyday. That's when Roger and Hammerstein are writing. That's when Bach and Harnack are writing. It's when Lerner and Lower are writing. So you have all these theaters. Arthur Miller is writing. Tennessee Williams is writing. You have all these American playwrights producing all this amazing artwork. And Joe Meltziner is the one who is at the forefront, again, of changing, depending upon the style of the play. Meltziner shifts between realism and impressionism and expressionism at will. Even though he is I would say he has a very strong style in his art, he doesn't impose the style on the design. He lets the show speak for itself, which again is what I'm going to say most of you, and I hope to have taught over the course of the semester, is that even though we all have preferences, ultimately the play is the thing where you get your information. Stanley McCandless was the man who literally wrote the book on lighting design. He's the one that figured out area lighting and having 360 degrees of coverage. In the lighting class, we'll talk much more about that, having the 4 layers of lighting, where you have area lighting, you have mood lighting, you have practical lighting, and then you have lights that are specials. Those are the 4 layers according to McCandless. McCandless and Meltziner both taught at Yale, and they established the Yale School of Drama as the eminent school of design in America, and it has kept that reputation over the past 50 years with Ming-Cho Lee and Jennifer Tipton. Jennifer Tipton's lighting designer, Ming-Cho Lee is the set designer. One of the major influencers in the world outside of America is a man named Joseph Svoboda. Svoboda lived from 1920 to 2002, and just to end our session on the history of design, here's a little.
His raw materials were dark, combining science with art. He started work with his hands as a carpenter, but soon realized that he belonged on the edge of physics. Using innovative technologies,
Mě bavilo to rozkmitat vzduch. Jako když to světlo kape, víš, takový to.
Creating more than 700 sets the world over. A magician of the stage who changed the face of theater forever. Josef Svoboda, set designer. Prague, the capital of the Czech Republic, and for many decades, Josef Svoboda's home base, will host a unique exhibition celebrating the centennial anniversary of the scenographer's birth.
Divadlo je někdy náhoda taky, ale nevzniká jenom náhodou. Ta věc nevznikne náhodou. Musíte o to usilovat a musíte být poselej. Čili ono to takhle.
This exhibit will revive Svoboda's lifelong work through his models, renderings, ground plans, and large reconstructions of some of his most iconic designs.
To není jen tak. Já dělám s věcmi, o kterých se tady nikomu nesnilo. No, ale ten laser jsem rozložil střepama ulámaným. Žádná technologie velká.
With exclusive access to Svoboda's personal archive, workshop, and library, this exhibition will uniquely explore the process of Svoboda's work, his influences, and his inspirations. Be a part of uncovering Josef Svoboda's trade secrets.
Again, you can see how Svoboda works very easily with what today is called postmodernism. Postmodernism doesn't necessarily focus on the script, on the character. It is visually appealing. It is a cacophony of attacks your senses. You have lighting, you have movies, you have sound, you have all these things that are layered on top of each other. Think the Blue Man Group, if you've ever seen that, or Stomp. There's a play off Broadway called Stomp that is just people banging stuff and throwing keys in the air and all this crazy stuff. So much more, it's an emotional appeal to people, but you can see that Svoboda is at the head of that type of theater. Again, quick little history of theater. Your paper on your specific set designer is due today. You can email me that. If you don't have it finished yet, just email me when you can, and keep working on that finished model. Thank you very much. Have a great day.